Ira's getting impatient
I'm just ready for a great show, sir.
there.
Okay, I think we're set. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. And hello for a Zoom discussion of Indignation. I'm Nadine, the Philip Roth Personal Library Librarian at the Newark Public Library, and I look forward to learning more about this novel. Please feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat at any time or in the Q&A as they come to you as this program's going along, and then we'll address them at the end. Please note that if you're using the chat, please do send the message to all participants and all panelists so that everybody can see your question. We've gotten some questions beforehand, so we'll mix them up as we go along at the end. And the webinar is also being recorded, so it's being streamed to our Facebook page right now, and then in a few days it'll be available on the Newark Public Library's YouTube page. Our host today is James Bloom, Professor of English at Muhlenberg College. Bloom is currently writing Roth's Wars, A Career in Conflict, a study of Roth's war writing, to be published this fall. Welcome, Mr. Bloom.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start out with some slides. And if you have the book with you, it's also keyed with page numbers. Key to the pages in the first edition. Just as a way of framing our conversation, I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to share these slides with you now, if it works. Okay, can everyone see that? Is that where we are today? First of all, even though none of us is there, except perhaps Nadine and Eric, welcome to Newark, virtual Newark, where Indignation begins in the week-wake enclave that's so familiar to Roth's readers, as is much of the rest of the city that also features prominently in Indignation. There's a scene where Marcus is describing the commuter college he attended, and he relates it to the larger landscape. He says, the college consisted of two undistinguished buildings, an old abandoned brick smoke-stained brewery down by the industrial riverfront that looked a neoclassical stone building that looked just like it had been. And then he refers to the city later on in the novel as hardworking, coarse-grained, bribe-ridden, semi-xenophobic, Irish, Italian, German, Slavic, Jewish, Negro, Newark. It's also the Newark that the city that Roth loved, but it's also the city that Roth, along with Marcus Messner, couldn't wait to get out of as soon as he could. So I think that's an important tension to keep in mind in thinking about Indignation. But what's really striking is whatever nostalgia Roth/Marcus felt for Newark, it goes in some unusual directions. Most sentences that begin as a child are not likely to end as a child. I'd sometimes been taken to the slaughterhouse on Astor Street in Newark's Iron Brown section, to the chicken market at the far end of Bergen Street. And then you'll remember that Roth has Marcus go into a long description of the evisceration and the kosher slaughter of the chickens. There's a lot of blood and a lot of meat in the novel, as you probably remember. Okay, this book is part of the what's called the Nemesis trilogy among Rothites and others, including the Library of America. And it's one of two Newark-centered novels in the tetralogy that includes Everyman, Indignation, The Humbling, and Nemesis, Nemesis being the other one. But as Matthew Shai pointed out in his recent book, Indignation, the title and the whole concept, goes back at least to 1969, where Alexander Portnoy decided that his favorite word in the English language was indignation, which he got, as Marcus did, from listening to the Chinese national anthem during World War II, when China and the US were allies. Okay, so I've taught this novel in 3 different courses over the past decade, almost since the book was published more than about 13 years ago. I taught in a contemporary fiction class and ethnicity in US literature class, and most recently in an upper level class called the Literature and Film of the Cold War. And it was this experience teaching Indignation in the Cold War class that helped inspire my most recent book project that Nadine referred to, Roth's Wars, A Career in Conflict. Now, most of Roth's readers are very well versed with Philip Roth's obsession with World War II, going back at least to Defender of the Faith at the beginning of his career, to the plot against America in the last decade of his career. And also, Amy Pizorski, who I saw is on the chat, writes about that. Roth's preoccupation with what we call the Vietnam War, America's invasion of Indochina, in at least 3 books: Our Gang, back in the early 1970s, American Pastoral, which involves a lot of protest against the Vietnam War, and The Human Stain, which prominently features a traumatized Vietnam veteran. But those who know Roth, even those who know Roth, may be less familiar with Roth's more personal interest in, what was unofficially called the Korean War. And I just want to briefly sort of track the path to Indignation, the path through Roth's preoccupation with the Korean War. Back in 1962, Roth published a story in the New Yorker called Novotny's Pain, about a character like Marcus Messner, who was drafted at the beginning of the Korean War, and who, like Marcus Messner, was afraid of dying in Korea. He admitted his fear of death and his hate of the army, and that he didn't want to go to Korea. And you remember, in reading Indignation, that every decision and every crisis Marcus faces is shadowed by his fear of being drafted and ending up in Korea. Very briefly, at the beginning of the 1977 novel, The Professor of Desire, the narrator, David Kepish, refers to a friend of his who, like Marcus, was kicked out of college and then was threatened with being drafted. And at the beginning of the 1979, the ghostwriter Zuckerman, in his first full-fledged appearance as Roth's go-to narrator, identifies himself as a Korean War era U.S. Army veteran. I'd served in the Army stationed just an hour from home at Fort Dix, where Roth also served, writing public information for a major, even while the massacre for which my body had been drafted was bloodily concluded in Korea. So I call these stories Novotny's Pain, and very briefly, The Professor of Desire, and The Ghostwriter, and of course, Indignation, as Roth's There But For the Grace of God Go I novels or stories. So, if nothing else, Indignation, prompted readers 14 years ago to remember what is often thought of as the forgotten war. It wasn't even a war, it was a police action. Although it was certainly, I don't know if you watched the news this morning, in the headlines this morning, headlines that are based on the fact that this war still hasn't ended. Now, more broadly, Indignation reminds us not to underestimate, or not to overlook, I should say, how the universal conscription, the draft that was enforced from 1940 to the mid-1970s, affected Roth's own life choices. And you can see this, again, throughout his career in various stories and novels. So beyond Korea, Roth had increasingly, I think, his work became grounded in the broader American historical narrative. And that's why there's a scene when Marcus has his appendix out and is in the hospital, and his mother comes to visit. She has him read to her from her from his textbook, from his American history class. And if you're interested in that, Matthew Shipe, I don't know if Matthew's on the call, has written at some length about this scene in Indignation. So in addition to, reflecting this immersion in American history, which Roth talked about in a 2018 interview with Charles McGrath, that he had stopped reading fiction and was reading mostly American history. I just want to briefly mention the literary background, because that's what I do, to Indignation. Obviously, the main setting of the story of Marcus Mesner takes place at Winesburg College in Winesburg, Ohio. And, that's based on Roth's interest in the work of Sherwood Anderson, who I've sometimes have argued really founded modern American fiction back in 1919, when he published this Winesburg, Ohio, which you can't even call a novel and you can't even call a collection of stories. And here Roth kind of name checks Sherwood Anderson as one of his influences. If you have any questions about the extent of Sherwood Anderson's role in Roth's literary development, I suggest you look at page 209 and 210 in Indignation, where Roth vividly recounts the death of Marcus's roommate, Elwyn Ayres, which seems very clearly a kind of reprise of this passage. I won't read the whole thing on the screen, about someone colliding with a train and a horse and wagon, rather than in a 1940 Plymouth in Winesburg, Ohio. And here's a more obscure point of reference and point of departure. And it's another one of these writers that Roth name checked here in this 2017 New Yorker piece, where he talks about Theodore Dreiser, mentions Theodore Dreiser as one of his forebears, one of his literary forebears. And this is a story that was published actually twice in 1901 and 1918. And the whole plot premise of the story, the whole plot is set in motion when a butcher, an immigrant butcher, locks his child out for her supposedly wayward behavior. One last slide here. And I always tell students, you can't ignore the epigraph to a book or a novel or a poem. And I think the epigraph from E.E. Cummings' 1931 poem, I Sing of Olaf, Glad and Big, reverberates throughout Indignation. And again, my footnote here is a shout out to Larry Schwartz, just up the road from the library in Montclair State, who wrote a really deep analysis of how this poem resonates in Indignation. If anyone wants to talk about the movie in the question session, let's go for it. It's one of about 10 screen adaptations of Roth's work. I saw Ira Nadel's in the chat. And he certainly has had a lot to say about screen adaptations of Roth's work. Okay, let's get rid of the screen share and get some questions.
Okay, so again, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and I'll start off with some questions that we got beforehand. Is the moral of the story that spreading truth to power will kill you?
Does that have to have a yes or no answer? Well, I would say, I'm always tempting to play Philip Roth because I've been so immersed in him. And he might say, well, I don't know if the story has a moral. It may have more than one. But I do think that the whole question of speaking truth to power is certainly very much in the foreground of Indignation. But I also think that Marcus is not an entirely credible character, even when he's narrating, which he's usually doing, except for some, third person interventions. But he is, he's kind of a callow kid as well as being smart and daring. So I'm not sure that we can take, Marcus as the voice of the moral of the story. Although, he certainly says some things that we all agree with, at least I don't know if we all do, but about authority and religion and I guess we'd say the sexual mores of 1950. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to give a yes or no answer on that, but anyone weigh in. I'd like to hear the vote, how it plays out.
Is the film a success or a failure, and why?
The 2016 adaptation. Again, I'm so immersed in Roth that I don't think that any of the adaptations of his work I've seen are successes. If we believe that, screen adaptations of novels are supposed to be faithful to the original text. So it's success, it's a movie and it's diverting and it's pretty well acted. And the period atmosphere is evoked and kind of, prettified. But so in that respect, it's a success as a diverting movie. When I talk, sometimes when I talk about adaptations, I tell students that whoever made that movie is doing pretty much, what you're being asked to do in your English classes, and that is to offer a persuasive interpretation of the text. So I think that's where I'll leave that question, whether or not it should do that and whether or not it does do that.
And continuing on that, let's see. Since you talked about movies, I think that a series would be a lot better than a single movie. This is from William. Are there any plans that you know of for a series being created? The films aren't very good to me.
No, my people in Hollywood haven't gotten back to me yet.
And from Amy, you say there is a lot of animal slaughter, animal viscera in the butcher scenes of the novel. How do you think this might be a political commentary on the Korean War?
Yeah, I think that it certainly is, and maybe, since I've been thinking about this a lot on war in general, that, so the question is, are we kind of, I'll give this, kind of either or, although it's, more complicated than that. Is Marcus sensitized to death and blood because of his experience, working in the butcher business, or is he desensitized and kind of inured to it? And again, so is so then we think about the reader's experience when reading about Marcus's evisceration. One argument, or inference is, well, it's all slaughter out there. All species are doing it. And that's the way it is, or this is horrible, and you might be moved as a reader, if you're responding politically, to become anti-war or more anti-war than you had been. And Amy herself has written about the aftermath of war and the way it plays out in Roth's novels. So if you want to elaborate on her question, I'd love that.
Any comments on 12th Night Connection, Malvolio, Olivia?
I don't want to venture too much into Shakespeare or pretend to be an expert, but obviously, Olivia is the name of the love interest in 12th Night, and broadly speaking, 12th Night, as we know, is a comedy. And this goes back to undergraduate. There's a famous book, or once famous book, by a guy named Joe Barber, called Shakespeare's Festive Comedies, which pretty much, talks about all of Shakespeare's comedies as built on a marriage plot, with a more or less, happily ever after ending. So as kind of, what I might call a tease to the reader. Oh, we have Twelfth Night and here we have Olivia. This is how it's supposed to end. And then there's the way Roth actually ends the story. So the allusion, if I'm getting too literary here, stop me. The allusion becomes kind of a counterpoint to the plot of Indignation, rather than, paralleling it.
Where would you place Indignation among Roth's vast number of extraordinary works?
Oh gosh, if I just said eighth, could I get out of answering the question? I mean, it's not, let's say, as important or as rewarding to me as, say, American Pastoral. And it's not as surprising, and here I might get some pushback, as the great American novel. So I have to sort of pair it with, another Roth novel to answer that question. If the questioner wants to tell me where I should rank it, that would be very helpful. But yeah, I mean, I've taught it, as I said, 3 or 4 times. I've written about it. So obviously it's important to me, not just in talking about Roth, but in talking about, American writing and American culture. And just that I've taught it in a Cold War course means that I'm also teaching it as kind of a history or sociology work, which of course you can do with a lot of Roth's writing. So my answer is it's a very important book. And it's more important than The Breast or Deception, or even The Big Letting Go. So I've given a lot of options there as to where to place it in relation to other Roth works. I need some water here.
How biographical is the work? Is Weinsberg College based on Roth's experience at Bucknell?
Yeah, it's loosely based on it. It also reminded me a lot of the college where I've worked for several decades now, which in the 50s had all the same features, mandatory chapel, a church affiliation, the jocks in charge. I thought, I don't know, and Roth in the facts seems to talk about Bucknell in similar terms. I don't think that Roth had to deal with a Dean Caldwell at Bucknell, although he did get in trouble. He doesn't really, at least in the facts, doesn't go in deeply into the rhetoric of the disciplinarians at Bucknell. So I think, it's a stretch to kind of just map it onto Roth's experience at Bucknell. I think that the broader question, is Roth's interest and depictions of education and higher education in general. What am I thinking about here? Well, going back to Hebrew school in the conversion of the Jews, or Bucky's experience at Panzer College and Sweet's experience at Panzer College. Oh, and of course, it's Human Stain, which is often kind of billed as a campus novel. I think Indignation is actually more of a campus novel than Human Stain.
From Eve, please discuss the narrative voice in the novel.
From whom?
Eve.
Eve. Yeah, I actually had that in my notes, but cut it, in the overview I gave. But I do think that when Marcus is now, I did refer to it. Again, I'll just say that as a teacher, it's it's kind of, very handy if I could come into a classroom and say, oh, this is a first person narrative. Oh, this is a third person narrative. And one of the things that's interesting to me about Indignation, and sometimes vexing, and Roth does this elsewhere as well, is that you can't just come in and flatly say, oh, third person, first person, because especially Roth makes a real point of that, because for much of the novel, Marcus is speaking either under morphine, that's the title of the first section, long first section, or he's speaking posthumously. And then there's that historical note at the very end where it's clearly just an adult third person providing some kind of coda, whether or not that coda is satisfying or not, or whether it's kind of deliberately unsatisfying, is a question I've often grappled with.
From Lawrence, what about the Panty Raid and the January 6th insurrection, eruptions of the Indignation or ID?
Okay, I think the January 6th insurrections were worse than the Panty Raid. Sorry to be political here. When I never was in a Panty Raid, either as a victim of a Panty Raid or as a raider in a Panty Raid. So it's kind of a historical curiosity, I imagine, for most readers, in 2008 and in 2022. So I think there's kind of a, let's say, a calculated dissonance between the way we respond to the Panty Raid and the way the authorities at Winesburg College responded to it. And I think, for me, what the Panty Raid does is set up that speech by President Lentz, which I think is brilliant. And I think it's a brilliant example of the way Roth has, especially authority figures whom he and we presumably disapprove of, get the best lines. And so I think, the Panty Raid is important plot-wise because of what it leads to. I also think it's kind of just a brilliant comic set piece with the beer cans and the bloody noses and the underwear in the snow. But of course, a snowstorm becomes very kind of, I wouldn't say tragic, but maybe kind of a downer when Elwyn is killed because of the snowstorm.
From Asa, one of Marcus's sins, like Big Mendelssohn's, is not being able to keep his mouth shut. I think of other Roth characters who speak only the truth. Mike the Mouth from GAN, Mary from American Pastoral, who eventually expresses herself quite explosively, who are likewise punished. Can you speculate why Roth seems to punish characters who adhere closest to what they consider the truth?
I don't know exactly why, but I think it's a chance for Roth to, speak. Okay, I want to take it back to Sherwood Anderson, because Winesburg, Ohio begins with a section called the Book of the Grotesque. And it's a young writer, a wannabe writer, talking to an older writer, and I won't, go into it. But the older writer tells the younger writer not to think about the truth, but to think about truths plural. I think that some truths are more subject to be to punishment than others. So as I said, I think President Lentz in his speech, warning the students that what lies ahead for them is what lies ahead for Marcus. Lentz is kind of a bad guy, but he speaks the truth too. So it's not just let's say the woke victims or the progressive perspectives that speak the truth. Although it are the ones who get punished. And if we want to get biographical here, I think most Roth scholars end up going here. Roth, despite his great success, felt that he was being punished early in his career for speaking the truth in defender of the faith when the Jewish establishment of the time ganged up on him. It's not clear, for example, that Zuckerman in The Ghostwriter gets punished for speaking the truth to his parents and to Judge Wapter. So that's why I wanted to take it to truths plural, and what various characters represent. And of course, I think, we want to consider who gets the best lines, rather than, who deserves punishment and who doesn't. Because, some characters who speak truth, like President Lentz, also aren't important enough to have a plot trajectory of their own. It's all backstory. So I don't know if I answered that question, but is it on the chat? Can I look at the?
It's in the chat.
So I just want to look at the question.
It's,
I don't feel I'm doing it justice.
it's from 1:26 p.m.
26 p.m. 127. 127. A lot of 127 there. That's a popular time. 120. Oh, Big Mendelsohn. Remember, Big Mendelsohn gets fired for his potty mouth, if we can call it that, with the women customers in the Messner butcher store. Not being able to keep his mouth shut. Yeah, I think the go-to here, yeah, of course, there's Mary Laveau, who arguably punishes herself by becoming so ascetic. American Pastoral, I think Ira Ringgold and his brother Murray, both get punished for speaking the truth. Murray, is red baited out of his job as a school teacher. Ira is blacklisted. So yeah, I mean, I would sort of, to simplify, say, there's a point of identification in all these cases with Roth's own career recollections of having been punished, not very severely, as it turned out, for speaking the truth back in Defender of the Faith, and to a lesser extent, in Portnoy's complaint. So I'm still not satisfied with my answer, but let's move on. Sorry, Asa.
From William, you mentioned that Roth both loved and wanted to desperately leave Newark, much like Messner. Did Roth also run away from anybody opposed to his viewpoints, also like Messner?
Yeah, and I think that there I have to sort of defer to the biographers, because he was always leaving people, often for reasons that I might consider ideological or aesthetic. He was easily miffed, and if I'm wrong, I know that Ira's on the chat, that he'll weigh in here. So yeah, I mean, Roth did do a lot of running away.
When you teach this novel to students today, how do they react to campus life and rules in the 50s?
They think they're stupid. But what the last time I taught Indignation, I had this really brilliant student in the class. Well, they're all brilliant, but she was exceptionally brilliant. So her response was, that, Olivia lacks agency. That's what people talk about nowadays, agency. And for that reason, actually, next time I teach the course, I'm swapping it out with a book called The Memoirs of an Ex-Prom Queen from the Cold War era, which also talks about college life. But they focus more on characters who are affected and influenced by the campus mores of the time. So they respond to it indirectly. So the other student who's in that class, who had a memorable comment, who's graduating tomorrow, he's in the Marine ROTC program, and he's an athlete, and he had actually couldn't really get the narrator straight, so he came into class and said, "This guy's really sick." And I wondered which guy he was, thinking about, Marcus Messner or Philip Roth or something in between. So I would say that students don't really, at least as I recall, react directly to campus life and rules. Just kind of the impact of those rules. And they kind of take it as a given. Oh, that's the way it was. And of course, I tell them that, not long before I came to Muhlenberg, the culture here was very, very similar. And there was some hangover that even when I arrived here in 1982. So again, I didn't give a straight answer. I apologize.
A comment from Robert Singer. So much of this mirrors aspect of my life as a Newark Weequahic Jewish boy, worked in a store during high school and for 6 months full-time between high school. 1 second. Oops. Oh, I lost it. 1 second. Between high school and college that my uncle owned, attended some night classes at Seton Hall in Newark, went to a small college with compulsory chapel, but not co-ed, fear of Vietnam draft, even had my appendix out emergency, but that was in law school. I may not be unique in this respect. Exactly 11 years later.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess I would ask, turn the question on Robert and on everybody in general. Do you think that reading Indignation without this kind of deep knowledge of Newark and Weequahic and that decade makes it really just an entirely different experience than, say, my students or even Gen Xers, is that what they call them, reading the novel? And it's an important question to me because as you saw from my PowerPoint, I really care about context and the information that writers assume their readers know and often don't, as I know as a teacher. So I would just wonder, how much, Newark and Weequahic need to be known quantities to get the full effect of Roth's writing. And sometimes, I think one of the great things about Roth is the depth and the range and the intensity of his research. But then again, maybe sometimes goes too far. And I have to come up with, 40 PowerPoint slides to tell people who Douglas MacArthur was, or who Willie Mays was, or whatever. So I don't, then that's the question for me that Robert's observations pose.
So not to take away from you, but I'm just going to reveal that I am working on a Weequahic program. So it's going to be a history of Weequahic and then memories. So people who knew Roth growing up or went to school with him. So it's very much in its infancy, but it's coming and it should provide a lot more context for people. So if anybody here went to school with Roth or knew him when they were younger, please, put your contact information in the chat and I will get to you. From Dale, as a Jew, Marcus becomes a fish out of water as soon as he leaves Newark for Weinsberg. Do you think that Marcus would have received the same punishment had he not been Jewish?
Okay, I probably have too many of them now, but another favorite scene of mine is Marcus's first visit to Dean Caldwell's office, where Caldwell is, being very administrative, looking at a file, going, so it says here your father's a kosher butcher. And that really, is what sets Marcus off, sets Marcus on his path to Korea, because, he points out that nowhere in his application, nowhere in his paperwork, does the phrase kosher butcher appear. And, he's kind of accusing Caldwell indirectly, on the reader's behalf, of a kind of anti-Semitism, although it's not overt and it's not, let's say, indictable. But I think Marcus, the problem is Marcus wanted to be a fish out of water. That's why he was irritated when he first had only Jewish roommates. because he said he wanted to live with someone different from him. Um, he had a friend at Newark, his best friend at Robert Tree College in Newark was his teammate, Spinelli. So fish out of water seems to be a goal rather than a problem for Marcus, as I think it was, for Roth himself. If you just, again, I'll defer to the biographers about that, and the kind of social connections that he had and sought out. And it's interesting because even though he kept in touch with his week-wake schoolmates, most of his, social life, according to Ira and Blake Bailey, was not, inside that network. I think the novelists in general, important novelists, the ones we, keep reading, tended to cast themselves as fish out of water. Poets too, if we want to sort of keep going there.
From Carolyn, my initial reaction when I started reading Indignation was that it seemed to draw a lot, at least in the first section, from Bernard Malamud's novel, The Assistant. Perhaps the connection between a father and child in a butcher shop and grocery store is facile, but I'm curious as to whether you think there are any parallels between the two.
Well, I think there's certainly Malamud is an influence and a predecessor. And, I think that Malamud's Brooklyn, or let's say E.L. Dr. Rose the Bronx, are, we call them other weekwakes, and sort of, so all these writers were very, I can name a few more, who were kind of, mining their experience in these urban Jewish enclaves, and the ways in which Malamud and Roth did it were at some points very similar. Roth's relationship with Malamud was very up and down. So I think that the way that literary influence works is you sort of adapt something from an earlier writer, an earlier work, but you also challenge that way of writing and that way of thinking. So, I think you also have to keep that in mind when you think about Roth's relationship with Malamud.
From William, I'm fairly new to reading Roth, so I don't know if this theme is common throughout all of Roth's work, but there has been some instances of incest and or sexual abuse in some of what I've read thus far. To that point, I got the impression that Olivia may have been sexually abused by her dad. Am I off base?
No, you're not off base. I don't know if you're on base either, but I agree with you that Roth kind of teases us into considering that possibility. And because it's fiction, we don't have any investigators to go check it out. But yeah, no, you're not off base at all. I think that, and there's a whole, in the course where I last taught Indignation, I also taught a very famous poem by Sylvia Plath, almost an exact contemporary for us, called Daddy. So that and of course, the possibility of father-daughter incest was already prominent in American writing. I'm thinking about F. Scott Fitzgerald's big novel from 1934, A Tender as a Night. So that's kind of a literary, what nowadays we would call a trope, or, a kind of subplot that Roth would have been familiar with and probably very interested in. So not off base.
A more general question. Why does Philip Roth use Nathan Zuckerman as a narrator in some novels, but not in others?
I think that, Roth, had a terrible, fear, if you want to call it that, of too obviously repeating himself. So, and I think especially, once Zuckerman had been around for such a long time, by the time he wrote Indignation, he may have just gotten tired of him. So again, this is all speculation, because he had so many different so-called alter egos. David Kepish, I think his last appearance was in The Dying Animal, and of course Portnoy, although wasn't a writer, was an alter ego. Maybe because I know there was a question in the preliminary questions about the relative brevity of the novel. Maybe there's simply no room for the kind of expanded narration and the kind of broad overview that Zuckerman was always interested in achieving. Zuckerman was always kind of an investigator, or if you think about The Human Stain, a kind of detective, trying to figure out the mystery of the protagonist and his or her circumstances. And I think that, the dominant voice in Indignation is Marcus himself. And Marcus obviously fails to unwind the mystery of sex and family and everything that got him killed in Korea, and he ends up speaking from a perspective of kind of endless uncertainty, and and he's still young, and he's young forever young, as one poet says. And Zuckerman grows over the course of generations in the Zuckerman novels. Oh, 6 of them or so.
Question in the Q&A, another general question. Noble or no noble, was Roth overlooked and or was it justified?
Let me find that question.
It's in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, Roth was very overlooked, but I don't think he was just overlooked. I have a stupid hypothesis about that. In The Professor of Desire, the other Zuckerman, David Kepish, the other novelist narrator in Roth's work, goes to Europe and, as we used to say, shacks up with a couple of Swedish girls. And I think they never forgave him for that. That's my theory. Swedish Academy, felt that their national pride, their national dignity had been affronted by Philip Roth. But who knows? I mean, it was about the time that Roth died that there was a Me Too scandal in the Swedish Academy subgroup that makes the recommendation for the Nobel Prize. So I only wish Roth had been around to write about that. It's a kind of revenge, like what's his name? Flusser is always seeking when he's playing Malvolio in Indignation.
Let's see. Question from Roger. Who is the father of Olivia's pregnancy?
Okay, I'm going to confess it's me. Well, I think that what's his name? Maybe what's the character? The fraternity guy. Kotler. If I were to guess, I would say, because Kotler talks about or alludes to and teases Marcus about his sexual experiences with Olivia, or someone like Kotler, that kind of character.
Okay, from Tim. Roth ends the second section with the lesson that banal choices leading to disproportionate results. Do you think he set out at the beginning to explore that life lesson when he started to write, or did he happen to end there through the process of writing?
So that's well, I think that that's why I on the slides I talked about the there but for the grace of God go I subgenre in Roth's works, briefly in The Ghostwriter, and central to Novotny's Pain. I think that Roth really dwelled on how his own choices may have led him to the same fate as Marcus's. So I do think he had that in mind, and I think there are other there are always bad choices in Roth leading to consequences. Sometimes they're comic, like when Portnoy has a skating accident when he's going up to Irvington to skate and look at the girls, look at the shikses, whatever. You can even think about Swede-Lubov's move to Old Rimrock as a fateful decision that has dire consequences. So we could just put all the books in a pile and see that how Roth was preoccupied with it. But here the preoccupation centers on his own experiences in the early 1950s as a college student, who would become draft eligible and perhaps die in Korea as soon as his student deferment ended, or as might have happened when he got into trouble. Bucknell was revoked. So if that's a yes or no question, I would say yes.
Okay. From Amy, speaking of Me Too, some readers have said that Roth is unkind both to women in his life and in his books. I would love to hear your thoughts on Roth's representation of Olivia. I find her so sympathetic, given what you say about the constraints of women on college campuses in the 1950s.
Can I see where is that question?
It's in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Oh, Me Too. Okay. Well, I find her, sympathetic too, but I'm wondering if, that's me as a man, kind of sentimentalizing, women's frailty, which again, is a real kind of commonplace in a lot of kind of traditional storytelling. And that's why, the student who raised a question about her agency and said that, she was not a believable character because she was kind of a stereotypical, damsel in distress. So that question leads me to wonder about, whether my response to her is simply, too reflexive, and too reflexively sympathetic, and denies the possibility that, she may be, more of a schemer than she pretends to be. So again, I don't know if that, answers it. But I think, she's a troubling character, and not just because of the scar and the possible incest. So you found her. So Amy, are you worried that you found her sympathetic, or? And except for Mrs. Messner, this has very few focal point women characters. So I also think since they're in that room together, and the two women in the novel kind of have a face-off. I would ask, if we're going to talk about degrees of sympathetic, not sympathetic, which woman character is more sympathetic than the other, Mrs. Messner or Olivia Hutton?
So Amy replied to you and said, does it make me a bad feminist?
Amy replied
at the end of the Q&A.
Oh, okay. I will check with the committee, and we'll get back to you on that.
Let's see, we have time for one last question, and here it is. I was struck by the acknowledgement that the narrator was dead in the middle of the book. It was jarring and changed the arc of the narrative. Thoughts on its reasoning and impact on the book?
I'm looking for, that's in the chat or the Q&A?
The Q&A.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Anonymous attendee. I was struck by the acknowledgement that the narrator was dead. Yeah, and I think that that produces questions about who's speaking, whether or not it's some omniscient adult voice off stage, which the voice that intrudes at the end with that historical kind of postscript, or whether or not it's all Marcus that we're responding to, and whether or not death itself confers a kind of authority on a perspective, or whether or not being dead discredits Marcus's perspective, because obviously being dead means he's like eternally immature, and as he often is, eternally callow. So yeah, I think that's really one of the most important kind of structural features of the novel, and I think it's one of the most distinctive features of the narrative in Indignation, precisely because it raises what we might call meta questions about point of view and perspective, which lead to real life questions about whom to believe, and how much to believe, whoever it is telling the story and reflecting on the events in the story.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to
Great
our
time.
audience.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for our audience members for these great questions. Our next book club meeting will take place on Saturday, June 18th. Our host will be Matthew Shipe, a senior lecturer and director of advanced writing in the English department at Washington University at St. Louis. He is the author of Understanding Philip Roth, which was published by the University of South Carolina Press this spring. He is president of the Philip Roth Society and serves on the executive board of the John Updike Society. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Jim Bloom for leading this wonderful discussion. It has been recorded and will be available on the Newark Public Library's YouTube page in a few days, and it is already on the Newark Public Library's Facebook page. And thank you also to Eric from the Newark Public Library for assisting with this program. And I hope to reconnect with all of you in June.
Okay, make a donation to the library. Here's the pamphlet. And if you want the PowerPoint, you can email me. It's part of my legacy. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.